Please join me in giving Judge Kevin Smith and his panelists, whom he will introduce to you, a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. Thank you to the Pachyderm Club. This is a very important issue, and I told John that I wanted to be the one to introduce the panelists, because let me just tell you, I'm gonna try to speed through my part of this so we can focus on what these awesome people are doing and the commitments that they've made to our community. First of all, Ashley Thorn is Advocacy Director of CASA of Sedgwick County. She has 16 years of experience providing community-based intervention services to crime victims and offenders. She is certified in forensic criminology. She has experience in civil mediation and has a BA in anthropology and an MS in criminal justice. And of course, she's a court-appointed special advocate focused on breaking the cycle of crime and violence using evidence-based community interventions targeting criminogenic traits through the risk, need, and responsibility model. Julie White, I actually have known Julie for years, also Tonya. I've known both of the other panelists for years from our church, actually, and she currently is a foster care home recruiter, Julie White that is, a foster care home recruiter for St. Francis Community Services, and she's been a foster parent for several years. During that time, listen to this, these numbers are amazing. And let me just tell you, my objective here is for many of you, I mean, it takes a very special person to be a foster. I've never been a foster, so you won't necessarily be compelled to be a foster, but I'm hoping that many of you will decide to try to do what you can. Now, Julie, for her part, is what I would call, also Tonya is what I would call this, a super foster. She has fostered 14 children and provided respite services for countless other children. She has no biological children, but she has 2 that she claims as adopted sons, some of her fosters. She lives in downtown Wichita and holds a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Wichita State, and she is currently working on her master's degree in human and social services, and she is a passionate advocate for children in need of care. Tonya, she is definitely a super foster mom. In fact, her and her husband foster troubled teens. Imagine scenarios that involve teens with the most disturbing issues. Tonya, I mean, she has so much love in her heart. She absolutely steps forward for these kids, and she advocates for them. And she's not only opened her home to official foster children, but also to others who just need her continuing love and support. So again, I think my panelists, they're awesome people, and once they get me out of the way, I'm handing this thing over to them. So we already presented this to the Republican Women United, and by the way, in a small group, this is a challenge to y'all, by the way. In a small group, we had about 15 or 20 people in that group when we had our breakfast presentation. 3 people stepped forward and became CASAs. I believe all 3 have already been through training. So they're already making a difference. So that's a challenge. This is the largest Pachyderm Club in the nation. We need to at least get 4 people. Okay, just one better, right? And of course, a few foster families. That would be awesome too. But that said, I'm going to start things a little bit different today. First of all, I know a few of you are eating, but I would like all of you to close your eyes for a moment and turn on your imagination. Close your eyes. Imagine you're in a room, it's dark. In fact, it's dark because the sun has gone down and the electricity's been shut off. You're looking at an 8-year-old child. And even though it's dark, a little bit of light is seeping in. You look around and you see garbage everywhere. You smell animal urine. You look at the floor and you see animal feces. You see cockroaches running across the floor. Now, when you look at the child, you see a child who's wearing a short-sleeved shirt that's dirty and torn. You see bruises on this child's arms. An 8-year-old child. Now, it's your grandchild. Open your eyes now. What would you do? What would you do if that was your grandchild and you saw what that child was living in? What would you do? You would get in your car, you would go to that house, you would, whatever the consequences, and you would remove that kid from that home. Now, in the child in need of care system, let me just be quite frank. Most of the cases that result in petitions filed for child in need of care cases are that. Most cases involve situations like that. Most cases involve single-parent homes of parents who have no idea what it is to be a responsible parent and to raise parents in a responsible manner. That's the situation we're dealing with. And the reason we entitled this the way we did, where's my remote? I lost the remote. Uh-oh, did I not bring it? Hold on one second. Thank you. I want to go back to the title of this presentation. The reason we titled this, Child in Need of Care, What You Can Do to Help Kids in Crisis, is it's based on a couple of observations. One, I'm sure everybody in this, most people, if not 99% of the people or 100% of the people in this room, were raised by loving parents. And even if they had challenges, they did what they could to make sure the kids were taken care of and the kids were provided for. You understand, you've seen personally what it takes to be a responsible parent. Is that a pretty accurate assessment? But in this situation, when we deal with child in need of care cases, there are a lot of cases that never get filed that are no less awful than the scenario I set up, which, by the way, is one of the more tame scenarios, that are worse than that situation. They never get investigated, cases never get filed, the kids never get removed from the home, and the kids get to deal with that until they're 18 years of age. Now, the light at the end of the tunnel, and again, I'm going to talk about the very long tunnel here in a second, but the light at the end of the tunnel is, because a child in need of care case is filed, light is shed on those situations. And these kids, especially police protective custody, will be placed in foster families that have been vetted, that in general have a pretty good idea of what it means to be responsible when it comes to parenting children. And there's also an opportunity for CASAs, court-appointed special advocates, to walk side by side with these kids. In other words, to a great extent, it's a blessing that a sync case is filed, because people like you have an opportunity to speak life into the lives of children. So that's the call. Now let's talk about the system. First of all, get my buttons right. Let's talk about the beginning and how this whole process starts. And I also want to be clear too, I'm not going to bash DCF, I'm not going to bash St. Francis Community Services. I'm going to talk to you about how long the process naturally takes when the government gets involved. A few chuckles there, right? But one aspect of this is I would say most of these kids have physical needs that require lots of money to take care of. They have mental health needs that require lots of money to take care of. They need resources. And the reality is the only way for those resources to be available is if they're involved in the system through DCF and through St. Francis. I can do a direct placement for kids, and sometimes it may be justified, but if a direct placement is made, all of a sudden those resources are cut off. So by necessity, a lot of these troubled kids have to be in the systems. And also, too, after the Republican United presentation, I did a research preparing for this, and what I discovered, it's disturbing. What I discovered is this is a nationwide problem. It's not a Kansas problem. And more anecdotal, more local, an example of that is St. Francis Community Services. They did a study to determine what their workload was and what it should be. And they discovered that their caseload, in order for the workers to have sufficient time to spend on cases, they needed at least 30, I believe somewhere between 30 and 35 case workers to work reintegration cases. They have 20. So they literally have 2/3 the resources to investigate these cases. And I know we have a representative here. I'll also add one more thing about that. And this is a federal issue. The Federal Department of Labor issued a finding that, understand these caseworkers have bachelor's degree and they have master's degrees. But according to the Department of Labor, they cannot be treated as salaried workers because they don't have sufficient discretion. So literally, they can't work more than 40 hours a week. So we have 2/3 the number of workers, which means they have 1/3 more cases than they can handle, and they can't work past 5 o'clock in the evening. So that's what we're dealing with, and that's a nationwide problem. It's not just a local problem. Now, the way the process works, first of all, you have mandatory reporters that report incidences of abuse. Doctors, nurses, daycare workers, teachers, people of that nature. And if they see indications of abuse, they report. You also have another couple of factors factor in here. You have neighbors that may not like the family, just in general, and you also have ex-spouses that want to make this an issue for custody disputes. So those reports are made. DCF investigates. And the reality is 90% of the cases they investigate, they either result in findings of unsubstantiated findings of abuse. Again, it's the ex-spouse or some other party that's just a busybody. Or they encourage the family to participate in what's called family preservation services so they can get the resources they need, get the help they need, so they can discover and act as a responsible parent. 10% are the ones that get filed. These are the cases where the police, it's such a dire situation, the police take them into protective custody and they file a child in need of care cases. Now, the next process, let's talk about the two primary, there's actually 3 tracks. There's a reintegration track, there's an adoption track, and there's an independent living track. We're going to talk about 2 of these because these are the ones where you can really make a difference and really help out. First of all, almost every case, regardless of how awful the situation appears, starts off with a goal of reintegration back with the parents. The statute actually says it's considered in the best interest, one of the best interest determinations is that they remain with their parent. Obviously, that's not always the case, but that's where they start. Then, within 72 hours of the case being filed, and I'm going to kind of fast through this so our panel has time here, 72 hours they have to have, this is business days, 3 business days, they have to have a temporary custody hearing. Most of the time, and at a temporary custody hearing, all the judge does is the judge determines if the child is in danger, and I'm not going to even go through the specific findings, but if the child is in danger, an emergency exists that necessitates keeping the child in temporary custody, it's a very low bar. It doesn't take much for a judge to find that. Probably 95% of the time, parents will waive their temporary custody hearing. So let's assume they waive. They waive the temporary custody hearing. Then the case is set over about 6 weeks for adjudication disposition. Adjudication, the bar's a little bit higher, but it's not much higher. The judge has to find by a preponderance of the evidence that's more likely than not that there's an unhealthy situation that the parents can't address. And once they make that determination, again, they adjudicate the child as a child in need of care. Again, most of the time, probably about 60-70% of the time, the parent will waive adjudication and we'll go straight to disposition. So let's assume in our case, in our typical case, that adjudication is waived and we have disposition. The reason I say that is if a person requests a hearing at adjudication, it's delayed another 6 to 8 weeks because the court has to fit it on its docket. So that adds another 1 to 2 months to the process. And you'll see the process is already long, but we're talking about waivers here. So they waive, the case is set out approximately 90 days. And the reason they do this, first of all, you have an achievement plan that parents have to follow. A lot of these parents are drug addicts. A lot of these parents have mental health problems. A lot of these parents don't have the ability to provide a safe home. This is why we do achievement plans. We give them an opportunity to do what they need to do so they can parent better. So 90 days is a fairly conservative number. 90 days out, you come back to court, and guess what happens? Does anybody think most of these parents have done everything they need to do in 90 days? No way. We come back in 90 days, and some parents have done something. Some parents have taken steps toward it to the point that DCF and typically DCF and St. Francis are given discretion over visitation. Typically, they've progressed to at least, let's say, 6 to 8 hours on the weekends of unsupervised parenting time. Maybe they've gone to that point, but they probably haven't gone to overnights. They probably haven't completed their treatment. All those things are still left to be done. So at this point, more time is needed. Typically, you see continuances of, again, between 90 and 120 days. Let's use 120 days for a more typical case. So where are we now? We're 260 days into this process. That's 2/3 of a year gone. And this whole time, this child has been in foster care. Usually it's a kinship placement, but not always. Actually, that's not true. In Kansas data, less than half the time it's with a kinship placement. So it's strangers that are fostering these kids for this time. So now we come back in 120 days. Now, we're going to go the worst case scenario. We get to the 120-day mark. I, as a judge, am frustrated because the parents they're still testing positive for meth, cocaine, whatever. They're still having issues. They're still getting into domestic disturbance with the baby's mama. And obviously, we reached a point where someone needs to lose patience and get permanency for these kids. So let's say I order the case staffed as an adoption, or I order the state to file a motion to terminate parental rights. That brings us to the adoption track. We are 6 to 12 months into this process by the time we reach this in a typical case. At this point, the file is transferred to an adoption team, and policy is that it takes anywhere from 30 to 60 days just to get the file to a whole new team of people that have never seen the case before. So effectively, we're starting over here. So now, if we have an adoption resource, probably a relative, it takes at least, again, we're 6 to 12 months into this process. It takes at least 3 months to get a home assessment completed and submitted to the court. So 3 months. Then if we have mental health needs, other needs that this child needs, we'll need SSI, we'll need subsidies, we'll need other things to help deal with these kids. That adds another 6 to 9 months. So we're going to go a little atypical. We're going to assume the kids have issues. So 6 to 9 more months. Now, things happen. As I mentioned before, these caseworkers are overworked. They simply have too many cases, and the fact of the matter is, because of that, not every case is going to be perfectly investigated and dealt with. So let's add 3 months, and that's a very Rick, would you say that's pretty typical? At least 3 months? Okay, at least 3 months. So we add 3 months to that. Where does that put us? And I put a range here. If we go from reintegration to adoption to finalization. If we are fortunate, whether it's reintegration or adoption, we might close out a case in 18 to 24 months. Now, you have kids that are 2, you have kids that are 8, you have kids that are 12. You can imagine 2 years. In fact, I'm required to take into consideration and base my ruling in part on child time. Time flies for kids. I mean, just the growth issue, the mental health issues, all those issues. For a kid, 2 years is forever. It is forever. Can we agree on that? Now, let's talk about some statistics. Again, I want to be clear. This is not atypical of Kansas. This is an issue everywhere. Nationwide, for example, these numbers just blew me away. Absolutely blew me away. Look at the case length time it takes for these cases to come to closure. You have roughly 50% that are closed nationwide, and this is not. I think it's a lot less than this for Sedgwick County. You have roughly 50% that are closed within 12 months. You have 23% that take between 12 and 23 months. You have 11%, and again, this is more than half that are over 12 months. 11% that are 25 to 35 months, 9% 3 to 4 years, and 7%, these cases are open for more than 5 years. And we didn't even get into the independent living track, but that's where these cases go. And there are an unbelievable number of kids that the parents, there's no way it is in these best interest for them to ever live with their parents. And if they're 12, 13, 14 years old when they enter the system, I'm sure it's substantially less than 50% will have an adoption resources. So they're done. They're done with their parents. They're on their own. They're being raised by fosters until they turn 18. And that's just the sad reality of how the process works. Overall, we have almost 430,000 children in foster care in the country. 45% are in non-relative foster homes, and again, this is coming out to, this is leading to the point where you can potentially provide for that need. 55% have a case plan go of reunification with parents, but again, you saw the numbers. If it stretches out, and again, this is nationwide too, and then just 45% were in foster care less than 1 year, and that was back in 2015. In other words, 55% in 2015, and I'm sure it's higher than that in Sedgwick County, 55% were in foster care for more than a year. A year. As far as numbers in Sedgwick County, these are the numbers. We have 961 kids that are in the foster system. 961 kids. As far as placements, kinship placements, only 291 out of the 961 placements. Again, we need good foster homes that are willing to love these kids. And these numbers, and I just cut these out of Julie's thing, so I apologize for the roughness here, but we currently have 158 homes to place kids in. We need 247, which means we need another 141 homes. Now, before I go on, and I don't want to pick on Leo too much, but and this isn't a call for that, but let me just say, there have been changes in the statutes that has shut down a lot of group homes. There have been changes in the statutes that's made it more difficult and limited to the places that we can put these kids. And I'll just say about a month ago, there were, in fact, just to give you an idea, and it's older kids that tend to be the bigger behavioral issues. And the older kids are the ones that would potentially benefit from these group homes. But what they're being forced to do locally, some of these kids, they have this daycare center, it's called Kids Zone at St. Francis, and some of these kids stay there during the day and then they go back to their placement at night. These older kids have no placement, so they're actually setting up cots, and these older kids are staying in that facility. And we've had at least 2 riots in the last few weeks where caseworkers have been assaulted. So that's the type of situation we're in. Again, the system has some issues. And again, we know our budget's very tight. It's going to be very difficult for funding. But the reality is, again, we have no place to put these kids. And I see this in court every day. So now let's talk about CASA. This is what you're here for. This is why we're presenting this. The fact of the matter is, it's long. When we look at it from the outside, we know it's going to be a lengthy process. There's no way around it. We have to take this long because these kids need resources. These kids need help. There's no way around it. But there are 2 tools and 2 options that put this system in a position to where the kids, the children, never realize how messed up things are on the outside. The first thing is, and obviously it's the hardest thing, as I said, my family's never done this. We have at least 2 of our panelists that have done this. But the hardest and probably the most helpful thing at this juncture are for good, solid families to step forward and to foster these kids, to give them a safe place. And again, the light at the end of the tunnel is this may be the only opportunity these kids see a normal family function and operate, right? Do my panelists agree with that? And then I'm going to show you some data to show proof of that as far as data on single-parent homes. The second thing you can do is you can become a court-appointed special advocate. And Ashley can fill you in on what you do in that regard. We've, again, Republican Women United, we had 3 people step forward to become CASAs. You basically walk beside these kids. And I will tell you from my own personal experience, I've had several cases, if it wasn't for the CASA, I would not have known about some very disturbing information that changed the direction of the case. The caseworker didn't tell me, the prosecutor didn't know, no one knew, but the CASA knew, and the CASA came to the court because the caseworker wasn't telling the judge what was happening in these cases. That's how powerful and helpful the CASA is. And of course, again, we'll get into some details. As far as the impact on these cases, it's very dramatic. These numbers come straight from Ms. Thorn. So for CASA, there's an 18-month case length average. That includes both adoption and reintegration. Remember that number we heard? 70 kids were missing from the foster care system. Do y'all remember that? They still don't know where they are. I think I read this right in your information you sent, Ms. Thorn. 4 kids CASA reported missing, correct?
Yes.
All 4 of them were found.
We don't call them every single day.
Right.
But we brought them home.
Right. So think about that. 70 in the state. CASA is a statewide agency. 4 kids, and they were all found. And that's because of what CASAs can do to help these cases along. 80% of CASA children aged out of the system graduate high school. Only 65% of all fosters still in care do that. And I'm not even sure that number is accurate, because I would be shocked if it's 65%. To be frank, I think if we're lucky, less than 50%, and the rest get GEDs maybe if the court stays on the case and forces them to do it. Ms. Thorn, did you have something?
That was self-reported on DCF's website.
Okay, self-reported on DCF's website. Okay. That's all I'm saying. 98% of CASA children remain with the same adult throughout their cases. That's awesome. Finally, and this number blew me away, 2% of CASA children go back into foster care. I had my sync docket yesterday. I have over 40 cases on my sync docket, and I bet probably 20% of those were repeat sync cases. 2% versus 20, that's pretty awesome. Now, I mentioned this is the only opportunity some of these kids will get to see how a normal family operates. Here's some data overall that I think is very important. 63% of suicides nationwide were people raised in single-parent households. 75% of children in chemical dependency hospitals are from single-parent households. More than half of all youths incarcerated lived in single-parent homes. And 37% of families with single moms live in poverty, compared to just 6.8% of married couple families. Again, we've got to break the cycle. You, all of you, have an opportunity to play a part in breaking that cycle. These kids need to see, they need to see what normal people live like. And that's the end of my slides. So with that in mind, first of all, does anybody feel really good about this right now? No one feels, okay, well, I don't mean me. I mean the system. This is, right? This is a sad testament, and this is a nationwide testament. That being said, we have hope. There is hope, and each of you have the ability to directly play a part in that hope that we give to these kids. With that being said, I'm going to turn things over to our panel, and if each of you could just provide a brief statement as to how you feel about what you do and what others can do. We'll start with Ms. Thorn.
May I stand?
You may, please.
Okay.
Actually, there we go.
First of all, thank you all for letting the panel come.
There you go.
Thank you for letting the panel and judge come so we can share our stories that we're seeing that are the children's stories inside of our system today. But the reason I do what I do is because CASA is the best kept secret to protect children. It is the community solution to a community problem. Judge identified the community problem. We can't change the system, but what we can do is stand along the side of that child and take some of that weight and share with them what they're going through, and we can protect them from those negative behaviors, and we can report back to the judge. Now, I must say though, these 2 women and all the other good foster homes out there, they're where you need to start first. So if you can open your home, please do that. But if you can't, the next best thing is CASA, because we can't take them home, because there's a place for their family. But what we do is we make sure that they have all their basic needs met. I like to look at us as the missing link. So there's all these great community-based services, and our kids in foster care, they don't know how to access them. The families don't know how to access them. So we spend a lot of time in the community with the kiddos saying, hey, today, what'd you go through? Do you need somebody to talk to about that? And then we'll make sure that those community-based resources are wrapped around the system who has no funding, right? To make sure they get what they need so they can get out happy and healthy. Do you want me to hand it over?
Hand it over. And I want to add something actually. CASA, it's an acronym. Court Appointed Special Advocate. So in case anybody's wondering, that's what it actually stands for. That's your primary role.
we've got a sound problem. We need to have him come up to the lectern.
I heard you. Go right ahead, Julie.
Well, I concur with everything that Ashley said.
This is Julie White, by the way.
Julie White, thank you. Sorry. One of my kids that I currently have has a court-appointed, or she has a CASA, and honestly, it is one of the greatest things that could happen for this child because she knows, outside of me, she has somebody else that's on her side. And when she walks into a courtroom, she knows she has somebody that she can look to and say, that person's on my side, But as a foster parent and also a foster recruiter, my main heart and passion every day that keeps me going is the number of kids that we have in care, also the number of kids that bounce from home to home. My whole goal is to make sure we can have kids that have stable, loving parents that can show them that there is life outside of the system. That's a big goal for me. Also, if people are not able to foster, we all know somebody maybe that could potentially open their home. So I'm always like, if we can just find one more home that can be a resource for them outside of their own family and branch together with both sides. The birth parents need support as well. But for me, that's how I get up every day, is trying to just find one more parent, one more person that can love on these kids and show them that there is truly a life outside of the system. So,
Thank you, Julie. Tonya, step up. This is Tonya Burke. This is a good friend of our families, and she literally is a super foster. So if you could share your
Thank you. I'm just humbled to be here, honestly. And the reason I do what I do, the reason I foster, is because it's a mandate of my faith. It's a mandate of a belief in Jesus Christ that says he came from heaven to come down to our brokenness. And so in the same manner, we're going into these children's and their families' brokenness, and we're meeting them right where they're at. And that's what my husband and I desire to do every day, is meet with the kids that we have in our home, but also to advocate for so many other kids that don't have homes. And I just believe, and don't want to offend anybody, but as a believer in Jesus Christ, I believe that God already has the solution, and it's his church. And the church has kept quiet for too long and has not risen up. And I may be stepping on toes, but it's time for us to get uncomfortable. It's time for us to stop going to soccer games. Go to soccer games, but include another kid, I guess is what I'm saying, is we've gotten so busy with our lives that we don't have space for the poor and the oppressed and the broken of our communities, and it's costing us. It's costing us in economics, it's costing us in culture and society. And so I just believe, and that's why I do what I do, is because these kids are amazing. And my husband and I got into it thinking we're rescuing some kids, but really, they rescued us. They opened our eyes to things that we never knew were real. They brought laughter into our home that we would have never had. They've taught our biological children, I have three who are 30, 21, and 19. They've taught our children how to love well and how blessed they are. And so I could probably go on all day, so I won't, but I would say that I just challenge you to really ask yourself, do you have space? And if you don't have space to be a foster parent, there is a huge need for us who do foster parenting for respite. You can get licensed just to be a respite family. That means when my husband and I have had it with the 3 emotional teenagers, the 2 tweens, and the 4-year-old that live in our house right now, and we need a weekend away, they've got a place to go that we trust. Because I don't send my biological children and my adopted children to anybody I don't know that I don't trust. So I'm not going to do that with my foster children. So there's not a lot of time off for foster parents. We have good friends, sweet young couple who are foster parents, and their heart are for the disabled. They have 2 bio children of their own. One's newborn, one's 2, and they are now fostering a 2-year-old and her 4-year-old sister who has autism, and another 5-year-old child who can't see, hear, and they've spent the last month in a hospital taking care of that child who has a severe infection. They don't get respite. So that's another challenge I would say, is that's the need. And like I said, I could carry on, but.
Thank you, Tonya. Didn't I tell you that they were the highlight of this? Absolutely.
Now we have a time, if you would like, Judge, for us to do some questions from the audience.
I think that's excellent. Let's do that. Let's do that. And again, you don't have, I don't have to answer any questions. In fact, there's some questions I can't answer. But our panelists are here, and I really want to make this about what they're able to do and what you
Well,
can
in
do.
about the 15 minutes we have left, we'll start with the members of Pachyderm. Please keep your questions succinct, and we'll certainly try to get as many as we can. I see the first hand over here, so I'm headed in that direction.
Hi, Judge. Out of the 7,000 that were taken in the study that was released by DCF, 96.4% of those were actually unsubstantiated. What I haven't heard anyone mention on the flip side is that there's an incentive behind that, and it's called Title IV funding. And with the statutes that we have currently that absolutely have a secret file going around where, again, you're not allowed to face your accuser, how is it that I have met with over 1,500 grandparents that have been denied access to their grandchildren?
Ms. Thorn, come on up.
Just to reiterate, to make sure I answer the question correctly, you want to know why a large amount of grandparents have no access to their children while they've been taken into state custody?
Correct, they've been denied.
It's because the way the law, I'm not an attorney, by the way. I don't pretend to be an attorney, but the law gives delegation to the contracted provider. And because the contract provider may or may not decide that a kinship or a grandparent is the best first place to go, the power is given to the contract provider to make those decisions. Whether or not they have all the facts, that's a different story.
Next question over here.
Judge, some of these kids are, violent, depressed, maybe mentally deranged a little bit, and they have killed the foster parents. How well are foster parents briefed totally about these kids before they're placed?
Well, I don't know of any actual cases where that's happened, but would you like to answer that question?
I've actually been one of those foster parents that was threatened, came out with a knife. She was my very first placement. We are educated by 30 hours of training, and then depending on the level of children that you do take into your home, if you have an intense level child, you do have to do an additional 20 hours of training to help gather as much information as possible to know. Now, I will say, I have a child in my home right now that it took months for them to diagnose her with the proper diagnosis. So it's an ever-changing education, really, for foster parents. I actually was able to speak with somebody at DCF level this morning about this very topic, on how we're going to plan to educate parents when it is time to have those conversations on tough kids, because as a foster parent, we are not educated enough. But they do try. I believe they do try, but that's why we rely on outside community sources like CASA, mental health services, caseworkers and case managers to try to get a collective, wraparound services for the foster parent as well as the child, more so the child, to try to help get them the services that they need, so that those events do not happen. And we put safety plans in place as well. So that's helpful.
Yeah, and one thing I want to add to that, and you can respond appropriately here. Also, too, if a person decides to become a foster, they don't have to take on teenagers that have a history of juvenile offenses, things of that nature. You can specify ages, you can specify whether you're willing to take on siblings, those sorts of things. So, and again, even with those specifications, we probably still don't have enough. So,
May I one?
sure.
St. Francis is not the only foster home.
Ashley, here, we've got a.
St. Francis is not the only foster home licensing services. Salvation Army, DECA. There's a lot of other places you can still go to participate in this call to action.
Thank you.
You indicated that a certain number of complaints are made by people just trying to cause trouble for the parents. There's some kind of family dispute or something. In those kind of cases, are the children immediately taken from the home?
No.
Until it's resolved? If they are, it's not that highly traumatic.
No, most of those cases, those are the 90% or more that they investigate and then they issue unsubstantiated findings. And I'm gonna throw this in too. I probably shouldn't, but also, obviously, individuals who are accused of certain things have due process protections under the Kansas and U.S. constitutions. And the reality is if one of those anonymous, and typically those complaints are anonymous, if one of those anonymous complaints comes out and the DCF investigator cannot locate the alleged perpetrator after a few attempts, eventually that case will turn into an unsubstantiated case, and they'll actually issue unsubstantiated findings basically because they couldn't contact the alleged perpetrator. So I'm not going to say anything else about that.
Best kept secret. What are you doing as far as marketing is concerned in that community? African Americans are the less to be foster parents. I already know that because I'm a community activist myself. They're less to adopt. There is the Stereo League. That could be, like you said, Jesus Christ. There's the Mysterial League that need to be noted about this because the majority in the Mysterial League are African American / black ministers. But I'm going to get into the black community. The other thing is the neighborhood associations, another way. And I know for a fact, I went through the training as far as what it takes to be a foster parent. What are you doing as far as a whole group of people, training them how to be foster parents? My deal is marketing. How are you getting the word out? And we also know that African Americans are less to be foster parents and they less to do the adoption. And like you say, Jesus Christ, that is my question.
Why don't we have both Ashley and Julie come up and talk about that? Because it sounds like we have a dual question. How do you market for CASA and how do you market for fosters?
Do you want to start? Do you go ahead. So, first of all, I'm hard of hearing, and I apologize. So you just want to know how we get the CASA word out?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, I think it's not volume, it's lip reading. Sorry. Yes.
Well, let me restate it. I think specifically she would like to know what CASA and St. Francis or other foster organizations are doing to market what they're doing, not only in the general community, but also to the African American community.
That is correct.
Yeah, so.
Like Tonya said, they won't have
Well, and let me add to that. We are going to present to anybody who wants to hear us,
Yes.
which includes the Ministerial League, which includes any group that represents families in this community. So be clear about that. If you've got somebody that you think should hear this, have them call me.
Yeah. As far as CASA goes, when I came to the program 5 years ago and I realized the power of the Supreme Court Rule 110, which CASA is written in the statute. Every child has a right to a guardian ad litem. Guardian ad litem is 110A, CASA is 110B. So I called the Supreme Court and I said, this is the best kept secret in Kansas. Like, why aren't we advertising? We're free. Nobody pays for us. We're community funded. We're grant writers. We're, coffee can collectors. So that's the first thing. We don't have the money to market. The second thing is that there's not enough volunteers. And so if we have 7,000 kids in the state of Kansas and we have CASA programs across the state, we're ready to take them if you're ready to stand along the side of us to help them. I did the math the other day, actually this was about 6 months ago. In Wichita, with our population, I only need 0.001% of Wichita to step along and stand along the side of these 1,000 kids with Judge Smith and I. That's all we need. So I hope that helped answer your question. I'm not quite sure. St. Francis has money. They get money. I get no money. It's word of mouth. So I echo what Judge Smith says. I will go anywhere. I will do anything to get the message out. But I'm literally a walking billboard with a very small team at the CASA office of 4 other people.
Our next question's over here. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, I do. I really do. I just want to clarify, though, also. I am passionate about foster care, and I just feel like God has given me the opportunity and the platform to be at St. Francis. So I'm working behind the scenes just as a passionate foster parent with the title. So I appreciate that. But about that, you know, as well, I mean, this money, I would love to know where that is. But no, we will present, I will send out information. I will come to any organization, if it's one person, a coffee shop, a church, anywhere. I am available to come anytime. That is my job. So I just try to look for those opportunities and word of mouth, whatever's needed. So.
Yeah, let me just add something regarding the number of CASAs. I really became a strong supporter of this program about 5-6 months ago. I had a situation come up where, but for the CASA telling the court what was going on, no one would have known, including me, and it was very angering for me. And at that point, I started appointing CASAs more often. But I still might appoint maybe a CASA a week, but that was such an increase that those orders that I signed appointing CASAs were dragging out 2-3 months before they were actually satisfied by CASA. And it's not because CASA wasn't trying, they just didn't have people available. Yesterday, I had my child in need of care docket. I appointed CASAs on 5 cases. And this morning, I appointed another one. That's 6. If there was a problem with me appointing a CASA a week over a 6 or 7 week period of time, you can imagine what it's like whenever we have some particularly troubling cases. And I think, how many did y'all just recently train, Ashley?
Well, they're not done yet, but they're training, and I think we have 14, 15.
14 to 15. So, well, I'm getting at least 6 of those. Yeah. So that bucket's going to be dry in my next docket. So, any other questions?
Question. When you have sometimes family groups and multiple children, does a CASA get appointed for the whole family group or just for an individual child? And how long would the typical CASA placement or the general range last from the appointment, since the case has already been started and gotten up to
good question.
Judiciary to Judge Smith? How long does the placement last?
Yeah, so when a CASA is appointed to a case, they stay on the case until the case closes. So I couldn't work for an agency without walking along the side in their shoes. So my CASA case, I was on that case for 4 years. So the child had came into care 3 times. I was mapped with her she was 15. And then I stayed with her until her case closes after she was 18. Sometimes though, we are not appointed to a case until judge is so frustrated that he's like going, I need someone else, and it may be 5 years into the case, it may be 5 days into the case, it just kind of depends. The mission of a CASA is to stay with the child. We do everything we can to keep that one person with that child wherever they go. If that child gets moved to Dodge City and they're still under the Sedgwick County court jurisdiction, there we go. And we're going to make sure we're making monthly contact. Our Supreme Court rule and oath mandates that we meet with the child at least once a month. We attend all court hearings. We go to all different foster placements that they're placed around the state. And so school meetings, mental health meetings, we're there. And did that answer your question?
Multiple kids in the same family.
Yeah, so if it's a family unit, the one volunteer is on that whole family. And so we might have a 12-kid case. That's a lot of work for one person. So I'm going to throw something out.
That's really rare.
It is rare.
That's rare.
Most of the family units are a couple kids. Yeah, 2 or 3. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If we know of a situation in a family
that, in this case, it's a personal friend, that got, what do you call it? She got, well, she's in charge as a child, but then she was in an accident, and now she's paralyzed from her neck on down, so she certainly can't. She's had a child since 6 months old, and that child's now 11 years old, and it's a terrible situation, family. Where do we go with that?
I'm glad Rick Macias is here, actually. That's one of those situations. It doesn't sound like there's evidence of abuse or anything like that. You should really get an attorney quick and get that case into a guardianship ASAP, because, and here's...
Yeah, it's a guardianship she has now. How we
I would get an attorney so you can transfer that guardianship. I better be careful. I can't give legal advice. I'm a judge. But the bottom line is, if you do a private adoption, you can probably finalize a private adoption with both parents agreeing within 30 to 60 days. This process takes 2 years. Guardianship, I mean, you're talking about a week you could get that done, probably less. Bottom line is, anytime, if you wait, it's going to be a long time. That kid will probably be removed from the placement, might be put back in it if it's a kinship placement, and you're going to see these time periods. That one might be a little bit less, maybe 12 to 18 months, but once the sync case gets filed, it's going to take a long time.
Our last question.
This will be the best one.
Hopefully, I don't know about that. But first of all, thank you for the services you do, and it is an important resource in our state. As a practitioner who's represented grandparents, who's represented parents in these type of cases, and I usually tell them, once you get started, you're here at least a year. Of course, apparently some of them are much longer. But for those who are in power, those who want to help, the idea is, and I'm stating the obvious, but these children that are in children needed care, they become adults.
Yeah.
And if they don't have the type of care or interest or involvement from those to help them, we're going to see that pattern repeat. And I'm sure if you've been on there, I've been here practicing long enough where I've seen children, clients who have children who later become parents of children needing care, and then grandparents. It is generational. So for that matter, then my question would be then is, we understand there's some limitations on funding. All right, and I realize we all like to worry about being overtaxed, but there's some things that we have to spend some money on. And there's some limitations on the ability of the DCF workers to work beyond overtime. What is the ability to turn to the private sector to help on some of those type of issues, particularly with homesteads that can be done so much faster?
I know Rick Macias really well, and I know where that question came from. Put a cost on it, but again, there's private versus the government. Private versus the government. And the way the government works is DCF has a subcontractor that handles these cases. In our county, that's St. Francis Community Services. And the fact of the matter is, unless a judge issues an order for a direct placement, a judge can do very little to interfere with the decisions that are being made by St. Francis and DCF. So whoever they hire to do their home assessments, another example, I've heard that from someone, not necessarily Mr. Macias, but I've heard from someone that you can do an interstate compact for the placement of children. In the government, it takes 3 months just to place authorized placement with someone out of the state. And then if that becomes an adoption resource, it takes another 6 months on top of that for a new ICPC plus a 6-month adjustment period. So that's 9 months. A private attorney that files for an out-of-state adoption, as long as the parents are in agreement, their ICPC takes about 2 weeks to approve. So again, to answer your question, if they are in DCF or St. Francis custody, I don't see really an option to get it out of the way they do things. Do you?
Yes, I do. In some cases.
Yeah, in some cases. And let me also say, and I'm going to get in trouble with somebody. I'm going to make one final statement. I know what some cases you're talking about, Mr. Macias. Bottom line is, and here's the problem. Here's why this process is typically long. If you have a case where kids don't have health issues, if they don't have mental health issues, if they don't have ongoing issues that are going to need constant care. Understand most of the families that adopt through child in need of care cases don't have money. A private adoption costs anywhere from $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. They don't have money, so they don't have money to pay for the adoption. They certainly don't have money to pay for these services. If you have a case where they have a good, viable placement, I'll just tell you flat out, I will not hesitate as a judge to terminate, to sever DCF and St. Francis from those cases, to remove them as parties, and do a direct placement for a private adoption. That is a way to expedite it, but the problem is if they need these services and if the families can't afford it, and I've had some families ask to delay adoptions another 6 months because they want to make sure that these behavior issues settle down. So that's the problem. If they don't have issues, this can be shortened substantially through private attorneys. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay. But if they have these issues, it is tough because you have people that don't have money wanting to adopt that certainly aren't going to be able to pay for these ongoing issues with these kids. And that's the problem. That's the big problem we have. It's these kids that need the most help. Now, do we have a clipboard for them to sign up to be CASAs and adoptive? Well, we've got to be really quick because I think we're wrapping up here.
I'm just going to say that you have to be really careful about those issues because we adopted 2 children at the age of 1 and 2. Had some issues, but you always think they're going to outgrow, but we're just coming into our issues and they're 12 and 11. And so when you're dealing with kids who may be suffering from fetal alcohol syndrome, with spectrums of bipolar and autism, and you don't have the system and the wraparound help of the system, you've got to be really careful with those cases because you think you're doing a favor, but it could also be detrimental.
That's not the case he is talking about.
No. Okay. Thank you.
Judge Kevin Smith, let's give him a round of applause. Let's thank you.